Let's make a start, and I hope Lesya will join us shortly. First of all, a very warm welcome to this virtual Ukrainian-British parliamentary dialogue on the foreign policy dimension. This has been organized by the Embassy of Ukraine in London. So a big thank you to the Embassy, and in particular to Ambassador Natalia Halibarenko, who is with us on this meeting. Here is Lesya, excellent. I'm Robert Brinkley. I chair the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House and also the Ukrainian Institute London. And back in prehistory, I was ambassador in Ukraine, British ambassador in Ukraine. I'd like to welcome the numerous parliamentarians who are joining us this evening. In the list I have, we're expecting 6 from the UK, 3 from the House of Lords, 3 from the House of Commons, and no less than 15 from the Verkhovna Rada in Kiev. So I think too many to introduce everybody by name, but they're all very welcome. And all of those parliamentarians will be able, if they wish, to raise a hand. There's a function at the bottom of your screen under participants. If you want to intervene after our panelists have spoken, to ask a question, make a remark, you can raise a hand. We also have quite a few other participants on this meeting who will be able to ask questions under Q&A at the bar at the bottom. And I see that one already has, in fact, put a question down. A particularly warm welcome to our 4 panelists, 2 from the Verkhovna Rada in Ukraine and 2 from the British Parliament. We've got 4 speakers who are all representing foreign affairs committees or all-party parliamentary groups on either the UK or Ukraine. They're representing both government and opposition parties, and all 4 of them are from the new generation of parliamentarians. I'm going to introduce each one of them in turn, and then invite them to speak for about 5 minutes each, in this order. Elizaveta Lisa Yasko first, then Stuart MacDonald, then Lesya Vasilenko, and finally Alicia Cairns. And then when they've all spoken, I'll open this up for general questions and discussion, but I would just ask that if you're going to intervene, please do keep it brief to leave time for as many people as possible to take part in the discussion. I'm aiming to finish the meeting after 90 minutes. So that's 7:30 London time, 9:30 Kiev time. And about 10 minutes before the end, I'll go back to the panelists and invite them just to say a few concluding remarks for a couple of minutes each. So let's make a start with Lisa Yasko. Lisa is a member of the Ukrainian Parliament for the Servant of the People Party. She's head of the Ukrainian delegation at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs and Interparliamentary, and head of Interparliamentary Cooperation, Bilateral and Multilateral Relationships Subcommittee. She's the first Ukrainian who graduated from the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford with a Master of Public Policy, and has over 10 years experience of advocating Ukraine through public diplomacy projects abroad. Lisa, over to you.
Thank you, and I'm pleased to see everyone online in this discussion. I'm happy to know actually that unfortunately we have a crisis in the world concerning the COVID virus, and we are all fighting with it, but it brings also some benefits to strengthen some bilateral communication. And I believe that today event just is a great example. I would like to start with mentioning that a few years ago, when actually I was working in Ukraine with a presidential office at that time, running some communication projects, I was dreaming and thinking that I need to get a better understanding of the world experience in order to bring some new changes to Ukraine reforms in the future. So I graduated from Oxford, and I'm very grateful for the experience that I had in the UK and for all the experiences I had, like both formal, informal, like communicating actually with MPs from a British Parliament, and also I did my internship and I worked at DCMS, where I work how some like institutions in the UK political institution works. That was very valuable experience for me. And being now a member of the parliament representing the presidential fraction, Sluga Narodu, servant of the people, I want to say that for us, it's very important to strengthen and to develop new links with the United Kingdom. We understand that today world and in the situation that we have now within the international cooperation, bilateral relations really matter. And what we have right now in Ukraine, we have lots of things that we started. Our team has started. We have a turbo regime passing different laws. We have just voted recently a land reform. We have some success in a judicial reform. We have some success in like agricultural field, and we definitely have one of our main focuses and challenges is war in Donbass, and of course occupied Crimea, and that's where we seek assistance and of course support. And we highly appreciate that United Kingdom has been always a very important partner for us, and always hearing Ukraine and helping Ukraine in that. As I mentioned, that Ukraine is dealing with many things like in security, in anti-corruption, in many fields. We understand that in this year, for example, we have one challenge that is called COVID-19, and some countries, as for example Russia, is using this time to actually lift some sanctions that were imposed on Russia. And for us, it's a matter of our concern, and we again really appreciate that United Kingdom has been very supportive in confirming that the sanctions need to be continued and imposed, and speaking about also our cooperation between Ukraine and Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and the British delegation. I can share also some personal experience that and also to thank the delegation from the British Parliament, that we had some common positions on a number of voting and the cases, and that's very important. What I would like to stress in our discussion today is we hear some worrying, sometimes alarming messages from some British sources that Russia is using lots of opportunities to persuade British government to weaken some sanctions. And I would like, of course, to hear our colleagues from British Parliament. What is the situation there? And of course, I would like to invite everyone when the virus is over to come to Ukraine. We could host such an event with the Foreign Affairs Committee in Ukraine and to continue our cooperation on a new level. Again, I'm happy to see everyone, and I would be happy to answer all the questions and continue our conversation later.
Lisa, thank you very much. And certainly speaking for myself, I'll be delighted when I'm able to visit Ukraine again, whenever that is, the sooner the better. Now I'd like to call on Stuart MacDonald. Stuart is a Scottish National Party Member of Parliament. He's been the Member of Parliament for Glasgow South since May 2015, and he's a member of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee. He's also SNP spokesperson for Defence. Stuart, over to you.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you to the Embassy for asking me to be part of tonight's discussion. It looks like it's been extremely well received, looking at the number of attendees we have joining us. Before I forget, I should say I wish you all the best for Vyshanka Day, which I know is, I think, 2 days away in Ukraine, and wish you all the best in dealing with the challenges of COVID-19, which it feels like we're all still feeling our way around to try and deal with. I mean, just to kick this off, I'll be very brief. Today we had a session at the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House of Commons, and my colleague Alicia, who you'll hear from, rightly raised the issue of Ukraine. And it's a concern that she had, and a concern that I share, is that with the pandemic and the fallout that inevitably happens from it, the need for Western societies and governments to rebuild their own societies, it perhaps presents a risk of Ukraine falling down the political agenda. I don't want to see that happen. In fact, I don't think any member of parliament who understands the issues in Ukraine would want to see that happen. So know that you do have friends in the UK Parliament. I know that we have John Whittingdale here, the former chairman of the APPG, and other Conservative politicians from both houses of Parliament, and they will tell you that this is a genuinely cross-party affair where when things happen, and things do happen, you have a responsive group of people in the UK Parliament who are there. The Embassy, I'm sure, will vouch for that when we are needed, we are happy to engage and have dialogue. Certainly, we've obviously had our general election in December of last year, and we got the new APPG up and running. We're hoping to get that properly sorted in the next few weeks. Again, really a sign that we don't want to see Ukraine slip down the agenda in the UK. I think that I've been privileged to come to Ukraine a few times now, and also spend some time in eastern Ukraine with my friend Alex Ryabchin, who I see has just joined us, now a minister in the government. Good for him. And really use that experience to explain what is happening in Ukraine back here in Scotland and in the UK with colleagues from other political parties. Your country is important, certainly to me, and I know to all the UK politicians who are here on the event this evening. We have a new parliament. You still have a relatively new parliament with new MPs, and I think the sooner we can start to build those relationships, the better. Of course, we can't wait to be back in Kyiv. I had hoped actually to be there next month, but that's not possible. So I think we do need to look at how we use Zoom as our new platform for diplomacy and to share ideas. We listen to you, kick the ball around, and see what has to happen. So yes, let's see where tonight's discussion goes. I'm looking forward to it.
Great. Thank you very much, Stuart. Our speakers are being admirably concise, which is going to leave lots of room for questions and discussion. I will call next on Lesia Vasilenko from the Parliament of Ukraine. Lesia is on the Committee on Environmental Policy and Nature Management, Deputy Chair of the Special Committee on Veteran Affairs, and a member of Ukraine's delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. She has been a John Smith Fellow in the UK and a German Marshall Fund Fellow in the USA. And she also studied in the UK at University College London. She has an LLM degree from London, as well as a degree from Kiev's National Taras Shevchenko University. Lesia Vasilenko has focused largely on human rights and international law issues, and has had a particular emphasis on support for veterans in Ukraine. Lesia, over to you.
Hi everyone. It's really good that we have such a turnout for the Zoom meeting, if I can say so, turnout. And I will start with saying a big thank you to the Ukrainian Embassy and to the Ambassador for initiating and organizing such an event. It is, of course, very difficult for all of us to meet in person and hold such dialogues and conversations because of the COVID disaster, I will say, in the world. But at least we have the technology which helps us out. And also, Robert, thank you to you for moderating, for agreeing to do this, and to John, of course, who has been a great friend to Ukraine and who is still here with us to sort of look over what is going on and guide us, I hope, on the way to this dialogue, which is actually being established. This is the very first step, I believe, of the new Ukrainian Parliament and of the new British Parliament, newly elected, where the parliamentarians from the two friendship groups have this opportunity to meet and speak and discuss first-hand issues. And for me, the issues which I would say are probably most burning at this point in time for both of our nations are those of security in the wider sense of the word, so not just military and defense and security in the traditional way, but also the defense and security in terms of the challenges which we and also the whole world is facing at this point in time. So I will elaborate on each of these, and I will also try to keep it short. So first of all, the issue of aggression, and particularly Russian aggression, has not gone anywhere, although it has already been, we are in our 7th year in trying to combat the Russian aggression and trying to contain it. And here I think all of the Ukrainian members of parliament are really grateful to our British colleagues and to the British government for all the efforts which have been exerted over the years in the various platforms, international platforms, in containing and suppressing Russia's aggression, in the sanctions politics, because really the UK has been a pioneer in pushing for sanctions in the EU. And now, as far as I understand, is even with Brexit, that possibly the UK sanctions politics are going to be even harsher than they were before. And really, I cannot say thank you enough, because at this point in time, sanctions are probably the only thing which are a true instrument of containment for Russia not to move forward with their expansionist politics and ideas, and the only thing keeping Russia from exerting more and more aggression towards Ukraine. And really, in this aspect, Ukraine will also do its best and its most for implementing similar policies. And of course, our collaboration here is very much needed on the UN platform and on various other platforms. platforms. This brings the other issue up, which is that of defense and security, and we need a deepened cooperation here. Such operations as Operation Orbital, which is today taking place in Ukraine, are much needed, and I think we need more cooperation of the same kind, maybe in the sphere of naval operations and cooperation in that aspect, and whatever other military and traditional defense and security cooperation we can get out of our relationship. This is much needed, not just for the containment of the Russian aggression, but this is also an aspect which is important for Ukraine as a country aspiring to become a full member of NATO. And here again, a great thank you to our UK friends who have been great in supporting Ukraine's endeavors, who have been great in supporting our delegation at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And I hope that our cooperation here will only deepen and only develop in this sphere. And of course, the defense and security sphere, for me personally, it also tackles and touches upon the issues of veterans care. And there are a lot of programs the UK has been financing to help support Ukrainian veterans, the men and women coming back from the war and re-establishing themselves in Ukrainian civilian society. The other new challenges which we are facing today in terms of security, it's of course the challenge which has been brought to us by climate change and the environmental challenges. Here it's something new both for Ukraine, for the UK and for the whole world, and it is our task to work together to ensure that the sustainable development goals are achieved and are met. And I believe that the previous parliament has already started doing a lot of work in that, and the UK-Ukraine Friendship Group has been focused largely on issues of climate change containment and adaptation to climate change. I hope that our parliamentary friendship group will continue in the same footsteps. I think that here we can also develop on this issue on the PACE platform, and we can work together with the delegations of Ukraine and of the UK within PACE to push these issues and to make them not just questions which are discussed by Ukraine parliamentarians, but also bring them to a higher level of discussion within wider Europe. Finally, the last issue which we are all facing today is the COVID, the coronavirus, and the new economic reality which will be imposed by the new conditions to which we all have to adapt and learn to live in. And this is where, again, the platform of our UK-Ukraine Parliamentarian Friendship Group can be used so that we can find new ways to collaborate, new ways to expand our cooperation well, and where I have great aspiration as to how our MPs from Ukraine and from UK Parliament can collaborate and find ways and solutions for the new challenges imposed by this new reality which we are facing. So this is a lot of the things I am hoping that will be discussed further in this meeting, but also I understand that this is quite an ambitious agenda, which will require a lot of attention from not just from the people who have gathered here to have this discussion, but also from the other members of the UK-Ukraine Friendship Group, which are many, trust me. And now together with my co-chair, we are figuring out a way how to best manage the group and how to organize the working process so that it will be beneficial to all members of parliament, both from Ukraine and the UK. And I think I will stop at that because if the other speakers were brief, I took a little bit of overtime here. Thank you.
Lestia, thank you very much. That was, as you said, an ambitious agenda, but you managed to cover a lot of ground in a short space of time. I should have said in introducing you that you represent the Holos, or Voice Party, which is one of the opposition parties in Parliament. And a couple of questions there which some of our British parliamentarians might want to pick up. Should we expect an even harsher UK sanctions policy against Russia after Brexit? And is there a possibility of naval cooperation between UK and Ukraine? I'll just leave those questions in the air. Now I'm going to invite Alicia Cairns to speak, the fourth of our panelists. Alicia is a Conservative Member of Parliament. She's the member for Rutland and Melton since the recent 2019 general election, and she has almost immediately become a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Before becoming a Member of Parliament, Alicia worked in communications roles at the Ministry of Defence, the Ministry of Justice, and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So she's certainly seen these defence and security issues from the executive side before going into Parliament. Alicia, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you all for inviting me, and to the Ambassador for setting this up, and Robert, to you for chairing this evening. Obviously, we all know that Ukraine and UK have a special and kind of growing relationship. We were the first EU nation to recognise Ukraine, and I think it's really important that we recognise that that is something we should continue to live up to. I was very lucky before I became a parliamentarian that I worked at the Foreign Office with the government of Ukraine a number of times. First, when I was leading counter-terrorism operations working on countering Daesh, and then also when I came over and advised the government on how to tackle crises such as forest fires. And I always had a wonderful time visiting and working with your civil service, so thank you very much. I think I've been having a think about how as MPs we can assist our Ukrainian allies, and I think it's absolutely vital we do. And obviously the first point is obviously diplomatic cooperation between our parliaments, and that comes down very much to security, I think. You know, when we look at Russia, one of the key points of difference is our alliances. You know, and that is one of the things that Russia is trying to break down, trying to challenge, trying to undermine. And so it's more important than ever before that we protect those alliances and come together to achieve things, whether it is countering Daesh or whether it's COVID or whether it's countering disinformation. And that was one of the things I worked with the Ukrainian government, is how do we tackle disinformation. But it's really important that we don't get distracted by the weapon that is disinformation, but focus on the more hostile intent behind it. And again, the same thing with MH17. You know, this is one of the things where British parliamentarians must continue to provide leadership amongst parliamentarians around the world to stand by the Ukrainian people. The second area is obviously trade. We are working on a free trade agreement with Ukraine. As MPs, it's really important we support this. I know we've seen really big increases in trade over the last few years, 120% increase in just IT. But this will really benefit both the UK and Ukraine. And I know that underneath those trade negotiations, there's a kind of wider diplomatic and trade support package that's been put in place by the UK government. I worked on part of it, which was about supporting, where asked, economic and democratic reform and rule of law. And I think it's important the UK government, where it's asked to do that, continues to provide that support, and that we look actually more at kind of interparliamentary work as part of that, because most of it is done between our two civil services. On the question of sanctions, I think this is somewhere that the British government has to lead and that MPs have to lead. We've obviously extended sanctions on Russia over the last few years, but there must be no weakening of it once we leave the EU. And I think Dominic Raab has been very clear that on 31st of December at 11 PM, we will align our sanctions with the EU, so there'll be no softening. But we do have a chance to go further. And Stuart and I have both been very vocal about the Magnitsky Act and how soon we need to bring in Magnitsky sanctions to the UK. I think you can have complete confidence that most of us on this call will be pushing very hard to make sure those Magnitsky sanctions come through. And so we have to keep supporting that bill and pushing for the right sorts of sanctions that will actually have meaningful effect. And I think the final way is by being a steadfast voice. We have to be a voice for the Ukrainian people. We have to provide platform for the Ukrainian embassy within our parliament, within our media. We have to not just talk about the issues that Ukraine faces, but celebrate the beauty of its culture and its food. And dear Lord, I'm obsessed, and I'm not going to pronounce it right, so I'm going to move on from talking about food that I'm obsessed with from Ukraine. But from MH17 to Donbass to, as I did today earlier when I raised with Lord Hague, the importance of COVID-19 not being used as a cover by the Russian government for malign action, That's what we saw in 2015 when Russia went into Syria. It thought it could, because everyone was focused on Syria, it could do what it wanted in Ukraine. At the UNSC, at UNGA, and we have to use IPC, the UK government's been very clear we won't recognise Russian claims of Crimea, but it needs UK parliamentarians to stand up behind that. And the question earlier was asked, are there plans to lessen that? I genuinely have not heard a single MP come to me or have discussions about lessening our strength of feeling on exactly that. So ultimately, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to discuss. I'm looking forward to answering questions, but my commitment and that of most of my colleagues is steadfast behind the Ukrainian people.
Great, thank you very much, Alicia. I'm now going to open this up for a more general discussion, and I see that John Whittingdale has already raised his hand. So John, can I call you first?
Thanks, Robert. Can I first of all say that I was very sorry that I had to stand down as chairman of the Ukraine Friendship Group in the British Parliament. I'm still a member of Parliament and I'm still a friend of Ukraine, but unfortunately our rules say that the APPGs are all party groups. You cannot be a member or indeed an officer if you're a member of the government. So I recently rejoined the government, so I had to stand aside, but I remain extremely committed to promoting relations between British Parliament and Ukraine. And I'm here tonight in a sort of observer capacity, but also still as a great friend. I had two quick questions I wanted to ask. The first was, Lisa, before we went sort of into our formal proceedings, said Ukraine had been fortunate that the number of COVID cases there is very low. I wondered if that, I mean, I'm very happy to hear that, but to what extent are you confident that the figures being reported are correct? Because they certainly aren't, I think, across the border in Russia, which clearly, I think, is suffering quite badly. Now, Alicia touched upon Russian activity, perhaps taking advantage of the current concentration on tackling the virus. One of the things I now do is work with our counter-disinformation unit, which is countering some of the stories being put around about COVID. We haven't got much evidence that that is being perpetrated by Russia directly, but there is some suggestion. But there is an awful lot of disinformation around about COVID. And I wondered to what extent in Ukraine you've actually seen Russian attempts to use the crisis to destabilize, to spread disinformation, to adopt tactics which we are familiar with from their side, but which have been given a new opportunity, perhaps by the present crisis we're facing.
Thank you, John. Can I invite our two Ukrainian panelists to answer that if they wish? On COVID, are the numbers of cases that are being reported in Ukraine correct? And are you seeing signs of Russia trying to exploit the pandemic in Ukraine for disinformation or destabilizing activities? Who wants to go first?
I can go first.
Lisa?
Well, first of all, the number that we currently have today is around 19,000 people who have the virus. And the numbers, and we get the updates every day. Well, I personally trust this information. However, of course, we understand that all the world is now facing that we cannot really say the exact numbers. I think the situation is worse, but from what information I have, this is 19,000. We have some problems with the procedure on getting tests or assistance if people have the symptoms. And I personally have like the friend's story who actually suffered from that. But the government is fighting this situation, is trying to provide as many opportunities for people as possible. However, the economic situation, of course, is also putting pressure on the situation, and we are forced to have the weakening of the quarantine right now. But I think, and on the regional level, what we hear, and also on the central level, that if the numbers and the statistics will become dramatic, probably the quarantine will be again fully again imposed in Ukraine. Regarding Russia, well, I can tell you that a number of organizations who are dealing with the human rights situation in Donbass and Crimea reported that people who live in Donbass and Crimea, they don't get information and the healthcare assistance. And I, for example, raised this question in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe at the Bureau meeting. In one of the meetings, and I got the answer from Russian side that Ukraine shouldn't worry about this because so-called independent Republic of Luhansk and Donetsk are taking care of their people, and Russia is taking care of the people in Crimea. So this is just one of the example of very big cynicism that I personally heard recently on international level. And regarding the fakes and lies that Russia is spreading, yeah, our SBU and the security services report that there are a number of cases that show that there is a there are fakes that are spread about the situation, and so far I personally don't have the evidence that Russia is doing that, but of course we should wait and to see the results of that investigations.
Thank you. Lesia, do you want to add to that?
Sure. So just a couple of words about that. In fact, it is correct that we have almost 19,000 COVID cases confirmed by the tests. Over 20% of those that have confirmed COVID-19 are doctors. And this is a big problem for Ukraine, probably bigger than for all the other countries. In terms of this number, it's probably 19,000 is probably not the final number, just because of, again, of the testing system and of the number of tests that are available across the country, and the way that they are distributed. And that is another big challenge with tackling and with addressing the coronavirus in Ukraine. Whether there is any Russian disinformation per se within Ukraine, I think it is a bit early to tell at this point in time, but it is for sure certain that Russia is already using the COVID situation across the globe to try to get advantages out of it for itself, especially in terms of, again, the sanctions which have been imposed against Russia. Russia is now opening the dialogue on various platforms across the world, trying to push for a decision to cancel or to basically get rid of the sanctions which have been imposed by it. And here again, thank you to the UK and thank you to all the other countries who have been very stern and very firm in their decision to maintain the sanctions and not to succumb to Russia's pleas to see a world as a united and better place where all the countries are in solidarity trying to combat this horrible infection and disease which is plaguing the globe today. But John, here you have raised, actually, with the example of COVID, you have raised a much wider issue and much more important issue, and that is the issue of hybrid warfare and the different instruments which Russia is using and will continue to be using in order to get an advantage in its aggression and in its progression with its aggression against Ukraine and actually against democracy across Europe. And I think that here our efforts should be united in seeking solutions and in actually implementing instruments with which we can counter these attacks of Russian diplomats, of Russian media, of Russian military, and all the different platforms in which they are using them against us, and maybe even think of a tactic and a strategy that we can use not just to be countering them, but to think in advance and how we can build defenses, how we can protect ourselves against them, but also what we have to offer in order to contain those attacks and so that they don't happen in the future.
Thanks, Lucia. John, did you want to come back on that?
I only say, in response to what Lucia's just said, one of the things that I was keen to pursue before I had to move on to my next position was the suggestion, which I think had been made by both Ukraine and the Baltic states, that we might try and get together to discuss particularly the threat from Russia in all the different forms that it takes as part of hybrid warfare. I mean, I know that's something that the Baltics are very conscious of and share Ukraine's concern. And I think it would be a subject where we would be very keen to talk to you further about how we can do what we can do to support you against those threats.
Good, thank you. May I remind our parliamentarians, both Ukrainian and British, that if you wish to intervene, there's a function under participants that you can press to raise your hands. Now, I've already got 2 people here, but I would encourage more. So Dmytro Nataluka, who is a member of the Verkhovna Rada from Servant of the People and co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on the UK. Dmytro.
Right. Hi, everybody. Very excited to be here. Thanks a lot. Just to quickly add on top of the hybrid warfare, I think it's incredibly important to keep the pace and to exchange with information, because what is really happening is that Russia is changing the narrative of the conflict. For instance, in the last Munich Security Conference, a document has been produced which is called 12 Steps Plan Towards Greater Security in Ukraine and the Euro-Atlantic region. And the following line opens the document: the conflict in and around Ukraine, basically narrowing down the Russo-Ukrainian hostiles in the eastern part of the Ukraine to a merely internal Ukrainian dispute. And this is a very threatening and very peculiar thing that requires a very precise attention and reaction, I would say. And this is another thing that I would like to emphasize, that the UK is able to play a more bold position, a more bold role in Europe against the Russian information defamation. But I would like to revert to Ms. Kern's statement regarding the soft power, because this is incredibly important. And I would say that in times of this lockdownomics, in times of economics being shaped by the lockdown, by the crisis, the countries are reverting back to bilateral relations. And this is incredibly important. And this is one of the trends that COVID-19 has basically revealed. Because if you think about it, the bulk of the response to the COVID, it has been national in nature and not led by multinational institutions. And this gives us an opportunity to rethink and reassess the relations and the things that we know about each other, to rebuild our connections in culture, in trade, in IT, in defense. And I think it's a great time in this, Zoom and online diplomacy. We are literally forced to do that, just like any other country.
Thank you. And Alicia, do you want to respond to
that? Just to say that I completely agree, and I think it's really important as well when you're trying. Ukraine is not the closest of proximity in terms of countries, and when we're trying as MPs to continually speak out for Ukraine, it's really important that we use soft power to bring the country with us, because we don't want, whenever people here in Britain of Ukraine, to think of a war-torn country. That's not your experience when you visit it. But also, it makes it a lot harder to build that empathy and that fight amongst the British people. But actually, I think the key thing comes back to hybrid warfare, which is when you look at hybrid warfare, we are being attacked economically, criminally, you know, criminal groups being set up and funded, but also it's cultural, it's informational. Fake news and cyber attacks, I think in some ways are the least of our concerns, because they're happening openly. We know of those conflicts happening in front of us. We need to bolster our civil society, we need to bolster our culture, we need to bolster our communities. That is how we win ultimately the hybrid warfare effort. And the UK government is very good at this, but there is much more we can do, and there's much more we can do together, I think, as two nations. But ultimately, yes, A, because we want the British people to be with us on this, and B, because of hybrid warfare, everything that can be done to diminish the view of Ukraine is being done by those who have hostile intent towards Ukraine. So we have to be offensive when it comes to hybrid warfare, and a lot of the discussions are solely about defensive, and most politicians talk about hybrid warfare just talk about the cyber, and that's a real weakness and something I've called up our government on. We have to defend every single level of our society, even down to kind of women queuing outside a bakery shop, where if you wanted to put disinformation in, you would go, right, that in this village, we know that all the women queue every morning from 8 till 9 a.m. outside this bakery shop. That's where you push your disinformation. We have to bolster everyone across every single part of our communities and countries.
Thanks very much, Alicia. And it often seems to me that hybrid war is not a terribly helpful term, but what we do see from Russia is that it's using all available means of state power, certainly not just confined to military, but economic, information, subversion, anything, and using it all in a very flexible way. And the better we understand that, the better we'll be able to counter it.
And I just add also, moving beyond the state control, that's the difference. An authoritarian states, they control every single aspect of society, and therefore they can weaponize every aspect of society. Whereas our countries will act within a state, within the rule of law, within what is state apparatus. And so we have to change how we think about defense and offensive capabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I want to call Sergei Vlasenko, who's raised his hand. Sergei is a member of the Verkhovna Rada for Batkivshchina. He's also a member of the all-party parliamentary group on the UK, and a member of Ukraine's permanent delegation in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. Sergei.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. First of all, I didn't study anything in the UK. I'm old enough, and I was studying during the Soviet times, so I have no possibility to study in UK. So sorry for that, but it's a pity, but I didn't study anything in the UK.
It's good to have you here.
Yeah, and after that, for 15 years, I was practicing as a lawyer in the biggest Ukrainian law firms. And after that, I'm the member of the parliament for 11 years, sitting in this parliament, and now I'm the member of the Legal Affairs Committee. So I would like to talk or to say some words about the international law. 2 days ago, the Ukrainian Vice Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Reznikov, said, and that's a quotation, that we need, as Ukraine, more help from the US and UK as the guarantors according to the Budapest Memorandum. I understand all the questions about the Budapest Memorandum, and I don't need the answer right now, but I would kindly ask the British parliamentarians to think about that, to find the possibilities how to use that international act to protect Ukraine. We talk a lot about the hybrid war, about the COVID and whatever, but we have a direct aggression of the Russian Federation towards Crimea. We have a direct violation of international law by Russian Federation when they annexed the Crimea illegally and when they started the war on the eastern part of Ukraine. So that's direct breach of the Budapest Memorandum. And I would kindly ask you to think how the UK parliamentarians could use all the tools of the Budapest Memorandum to start pressure Russia more and more and more and more. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergey. Perhaps I could invite Stuart MacDonald to comment first on that. Do you see a way in which the UK could make use of the Budapest Memorandum, to which we were, of course, a signatory?
Well, I'm almost wondering if Sergey can see my emails, because the ambassador will know that I have been in touch with the embassy. Admittedly, this has gone on the back burner because of the current crisis, to get a debate in Parliament about the Budapest Memorandum, because it was 25 years old at the tail end of last year. We tried to get a debate, but a minor thing called the general election managed to get in the way of that. And I have been trying to table for it for quite some time with no success so far. But my view is that it would be a good time to revisit the Budapest Memorandum. I don't pretend to know what the modern day version of it would be. There are other people much more qualified than me to pontificate on that. But I do think where the UK did miss a trick, and I used to get into arguments with Alicia's predecessor, Sir Alan Duncan, when he was a minister in the Foreign Office, and that was over the issue of Nord Stream 2. In my view, it is unforgivable that the UK has been so relaxed about Nord Stream 2, almost rose-tinted in its view of it, very hands-off, and we could have taken a more robust position on it. Now, that's just one mechanism. You know, as the UK leaves the European Union, something I oppose, but I can accept it's happening. I think the interesting discussion we had at the Foreign Affairs Committee today, and it was William Hague, who's a former Conservative Foreign Secretary, was saying that the UK needs to think about some of the issues or niche capabilities it will try and adapt as it leaves the European Union. A bit more like the French, actually, was the phrase that he used in our committee hearing. And I understand what he means by that. And I think that the bigger issue of disinformation is perhaps something that the UK could seek to use the vast convening powers that it has across various international institutions to try and build a coalition of willing states. It's going to be harder with authoritarian states to respond to this threat in a more coordinated fashion. You know, France has got a very good fake news law, but different states operating in and of themselves is a hopeless way to fight the issue of disinformation, when we know that countries like Russia, like China, like Iran, and other non-state actors don't recognize borders when they seek to weaponize and use the information space against people. And I always say, you know, people in the UK say to me, "Sure, why are you so interested in what's been going on in Ukraine?" And as well as it being important, because it's a friendly country on the continent of Europe, currently at war and occupied, you are familiar with all of this stuff. So we're experiencing through the COVID crisis very real weakness when it comes to understanding disinformation. I'll just give one very quick example, Robert. I'm conscious of time, and that was at the start of the crisis, there was a lot of disinformation doing the rounds on WhatsApp groups, on Facebook groups, that the British Army had gone onto the streets and were going to shut the streets down. What that led to was every supermarket had its shelves emptied because people were convinced that they weren't going to be able to buy food, toilet roll, and things like that. The direct consequence of that was that older people, vulnerable people, couldn't get any food for a few days. So I think we've now woken up to disinformation in the UK in a way that Ukraine has been alive to for a long time. We can learn from you on this. But as far as the Budapest Memorandum goes, we've got the perfect opportunity, not just with the UK leaving the European Union, but the integrated foreign policy and defence review that is coming up that the government has said it is going to do. And I think that's the chance for parliamentarians in Ukraine, parliamentarians in the UK to get together, work with the government, and come up with a Budapest Memorandum 2.0 that is fit for the modern threat picture and fit for a new relationship that we're going to have with Ukraine and the rest of the European Union.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Alicia, do you want to add anything to that?
I think I think Stuart's suggestion of Budapest 2.0 is quite interesting. I think it'd be very difficult, and it'd be interesting to see. I think the Russian government would make it its #1 priority to prevent it from happening. But I think actually the key thing on disinformation, because it is one thing we constantly come back to, because it is a tool for achieving civil unrest or for causing conflict between parties or between parliamentarians or others, is that what we have to really focus on. It's part of my background is how do I counter hostile activity. I led the UK government efforts to defeat Russian disinformation in Syria when Russia went into Syria and told the world it was there to destroy Daesh. And I approached about 10 governments in the days after Russia went to Syria and said, we need to call out what Russia is doing and who they're really bombing. And no governments are willing to do it. We all get very focused on the individual acts of disinformation. But actually, as two countries, we need to distance ourselves from the everyday, what they're pushing out, and focus on what are the long-term objectives that this hostile government is trying to achieve in each of our countries, recognize that disinformation is just a tool and a tactic, and focus on how do we build resilience within our communities to disinformation, and how do we ultimately stop them achieving their longer-term objectives. And quite often it's about ignoring their disinformation and instead focusing on what we want to push out and industrializing that truth and pushing it out proactively. There is no point countering most disinformation, because the problem is psychologically, if I tell you that the next person to walk through the door is going to lie to you, even if it's your brother and I've never met them, you will believe me on some level because I have said it first. And this is the challenge we face. So all the news we hear about countering disinformation has very little purpose. So we need to focus more on what do we want to achieve? What are Russia's goals over the next 25 years? And how do we bolster our society, our politics, our strategies, our securities, and make sure those objectives don't happen? And let them just keep throwing disinformation at the wall, because that is what they will do. They are not this highly strategic, highly capable, far more developed disinformation source. They just throw 100 things at the wall, work out what works, and then invest in what works. So I think we need to recognize that we can be just as strategic, if not more so, and really invest in what we want to achieve and making sure we counter their overall objectives rather than being distracted by the weapons system.
Thank you. I've got another question from a Ukrainian parliamentarian. This time it's Alyona Shkrum, who is also from Batkivshchina, and she is the secretary of the all-party parliamentary group on the UK in the Ukrainian parliament. Alyona, please.
Yeah, well, hello everybody, and thank you so much for organizing this event. We have to get used to this kind of online Zoom diplomacy, which is not perfect, but better than not having any discussions and contacts. And I just wanted to add a number of questions to the points that have been raised. Sergei Vlasenko has already raised a very strategic, big thing, but now we also have to move by small steps. And I think this kind of crisis from coronavirus could also be some kind of possibility and opportunity to raise very important issues by small steps. So John Whittendale asked a question about number of cases in Ukraine on the virus. And yes, we were lucky enough to actually close the borders and close everything to quarantine quite early. That's why I think that we have not so many cases that we could have had. But now when we will be lowering down the measures at some point, we will face another big thing from the coronavirus cases on the occupied territories on the eastern part of Ukraine in Donbass. And I have been contacting a lot of humanitarian organizations. As you probably know, right now it's a big crisis that Kremlin appointed authorities in the Donbass they do not take care of the coronavirus cases. They have failed completely to take action as needed and as we have taken actions, or the Great Britain has taken actions. They also do not provide a number of cases according to the world statistics that we see. And they also banned a lot of humanitarian organizations from occupied territories who were providing aids and were providing food and shelter during the past 5 years. Now some of them are really banned from even going to these territories. So we do not really know what is going on there. And a lot of humanitarian organizations are also telling me that this discussion we are having about the fake news, this is a clear case of very clear fake news when the media in Donbass, the Russian media, were saying for a number of weeks that there is no virus in the world, that it is the whole theory of Bill Gates, etc., and they didn't provide any necessary actions. Also, what worries us a lot is that the people who remain on the occupied territory in Donbass, most of them, and a lot of them, are people after the age of 65 and 70 years old, so people who were not able to leave basically the territories. And of course, they would be on the age group which risks a lot of having the disease. So I think that at this time we should also think about pressuring Moscow to at least provide accurate picture of what is going on in this area, in the occupied territories in Donbass, in Lugansk, etc., and how can we actually have this information from them, and how we can use this crisis to talk about the humanitarian situation, the health emergency situations they're going to have there for sure, and also the ecological situation, which was worrying for a number of years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alyona. I know that Lord Risby would like to intervene. Richard, can I ask you to come in at this point?
Robert, thank you, and thanks very much to the Embassy for organizing this. There have been so many interesting points that have been made. I just think what one needs to say to our Ukrainian friends is that there is no country in Europe that has a worse relationship with Russia of any size than ourselves. And so the idea that we would be in any way relaxed about sanctions after what has happened between us, it's certainly not going to happen. And of course, what we are, whilst we have left the European Union, we've made it absolutely plain on matters like sanctions, on security matters and defense matters. We want to have the closest possible cooperation. And I just want to refer to a couple of things that have happened, which sort of underlines this whole position. The disgraceful activities which took place in the Sea of Azov was a real wake-up call for us all. It was so completely illegal. And of course, what then happened was, I remember having discussions with our Foreign Office about this, is that there was a real movement by the British to get troops down towards the Black Sea, in other words, into Romania and Bulgaria after the experience of Estonia, where we helped after a massive cyber attack. So just on all those things, I think we are very, very supportive. I would also just say that to those who are concerned that because of this dreadful virus, we're not thinking about Ukraine. I know of, I think in a space of 2.5 weeks, there are 4 sessions to discuss Ukraine by Zoom or by Teams going on, taking place. And I just mentioned also that, our parliament, there is more activity bilaterally with Ukraine than I think any other country, and we've had a lot of more ceremonies and all that kind of thing. There are just 2 things I would like to mention. I made a speech in Odessa 2 years ago, and ex-President Sarkozy really was very aggressive about one thing, which was the Russian language within Ukraine. He thought that the way it was being dealt with was divisive and provocative and was not helpful in the relationship with Russia, although I think the word provocative is probably entirely on the wrong foot, because my goodness, Russia has been more than provocative as far as Ukraine is concerned. I would just like somebody to make a comment on that, if they would, about that particular aspect. But just one final thing. We've talked about disinformation, we've talked about hybrid warfare, but even in the Cold War, we had radio stations actually sending out the more truthful messages to countries that we wanted to affect. And I just don't think we are passive, we react, but we do not assert ourselves and our values in the way that we should in countries like Russia, in my view. And I've made that view plain over and over again. Thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you very much, Lord Risby. Lisa, Jasko, would you like to comment on that? Lord Risby's point, quoting former French President Sarkozy about Russian language in Ukraine.
Yeah, sure. Well, as you know, President Zelensky and our fraction publicly declared that for us it's very important to end war in Donbass. However, we're not going to make concessions on many things, including the territory, and of course, for us, lives of people in Donbass. This is the main value. Talking about the Russian language, I can tell you that this is much politicized. This issue was a matter of politicization, and we see that this is used as a part of manipulation and propaganda. We know that the Russian language, as other languages in different ethnic minorities in Ukraine, are protected by constitution. However, one state language is Ukrainian. So I don't see any reasons to say that a Russian language needs more protection. We all speak Russian, we all speak Ukrainian. This is not a problem for majority of Ukrainians. So unfortunately, this narrative is used by Russia and imposed to the heads of people in different also international organizations and some foreigners, but we need to work harder from Ukrainian side. And I'm very grateful that in this discussion we had mentioned the soft power. This is something where we could really improve our cooperation so that we bring more truthful information about Ukraine to the world.
Thank you, Lisa. I want to call on Oleksiy or Alex Ryabchin, who is a former co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group on the UK in the Ukrainian parliament. He's now the Deputy Minister for Energy and Environment of Ukraine. Oleksiy.
Dear participant, honorable panelists, I'm really happy to be here in this panel, and lots of things have happened till the previous meeting that I was participating. Ukraine has a new president, Ukraine has a new parliament, Brexit, coronavirus. We have a new chair of UK-Ukraine friendship group, but I see that nothing has happened with the friendship between our nation. And also, unfortunately, I see that the discourse of the conversation is also didn't change. So we are still discussing the Russian aggression in the Donbass. We're still discussing sanctions. We're still discussing a lot of the things that where UK can help to Ukraine, and I want to bring only one argument that already been raised about the climate change. Unfortunately, Ukraine, for the first time in numerous years, felt the consequences of the climate change. We have a really extremely warm winter without snow. My kids were really struggling without being able to ski in the street. We have a very shallow water. We have a low water, which has affected the energy system because we are affected with our hydro power station. And this also affected with the economic crisis, all this kind of energy aspect. And unfortunately, the COP, the Conference of Parties, has been postponed to 1 year in United Kingdom. I do hope to see a lot of good friends in November, but it was postponed for one year. And I also would like to bring this into the argument between our two nations, that Ukrainians are now much more aware of the climate change, about the consequences that it might happen. And I do see a lot of projects that we could do together in order to tackle a climate change crisis. I wouldn't bring more of attention to my honest person, because we have a lot of member of parliament and they are like to speak with a lot of, we have a lot of participants here, but I'd like to thank the embassy and maybe thank the corona crisis that brought us together with this beautiful Zoom seminar. I never thought that we could do this during the my convocation, so this is a really great intervention, and happy to participate in this discussion. Good luck to everybody.
Thanks very much, Alexei. And you've raised a very important point there about the effects of climate change, which is affecting all of our countries. I wonder if either Stuart or Alicia wish to comment on that. We were going to have the COP meeting in Glasgow, but that's now had to be postponed because of COVID. Stuart?
Yes, we were going to have the COP meeting about 15 minutes from my house, is where it was going to happen, actually. I think it's an important point that Alexei makes. I mean, climate change is important for all of us, and we shouldn't forget, you know, the point has been made a couple of times, there's more to Ukraine than the war in the East. There's more to Ukraine than the annexation of Crimea. If coronavirus has shown us anything, it is that it has many of the same struggles that we all do. I think the more we can work on issues like climate change, the biggest and most pressing threat that we face with Ukraine, the more we can assist and help, not just with the issue in and of itself, but with Ukraine's broader goals of Euro-Atlantic integration. Lisa opened the meeting earlier and she talked about the need for a good, robust discussion on security in the broadest possible terms. That has to include climate change and all the security implications that has. The threat picture is always changing, and the biggest changing dynamic of the threat picture isn't always, you know, terrorism or China or Russia, but climate change is probably the most changing element to the threat picture that actually gets less and less attention. Thankfully, and Alicia, I'm sure will come in here, but in our own Foreign Affairs Committee, we are looking at, it's kind of gone on to the back burner slightly, the issue of environmental diplomacy. And I think the more we can use the friendship groups in the Rada and the UK Parliament to talk about these issues beyond just the very obvious issues concerning Russia and the Donbass, then that can only be a good thing. And knowing Alexei as I do, he will not forgive us if we don't start talking about climate change. I still remember him dragging me around Kyiv to show me the signs on all the public buildings about CO2 emissions, which he had managed to get through the Parliament when he was an MP. So good on you for raising it.
Alicia, do you want to add to that?
No, I think Stuart covered it really well. And I mean, we all know that if we're going to make a difference on climate change, we have to do it together, and we can't do it individually. The difficulty will come how we get autocratic regimes to get involved with tackling climate change, because we all have to make a change.
Right, thank you. Now I think we've got time for one more question, which has come in from Thomas Brayford. What effect will the cut in oil production, the slump in energy prices, and the coronavirus crisis have on the war in eastern Ukraine? Now, there's quite a lot in there. Oil, energy prices, COVID, what effects are it going to have on the war in eastern Ukraine? And perhaps this is the point where I can ask each of our four panelists in turn if they want to answer that, or indeed just to say a few final words. So let's start with Lesya Vasilenko.
Well, yeah, indeed, a very broad question with a lot of challenges which all the countries are facing today in one way or the other, and these challenges are most certainly very much felt in Ukraine, in addition to the active combat resulting from Russian aggression, which we are still dealing with. So at the moment, the countering of Russian aggression and the fight at the Eastern Front has been made more difficult with the coronavirus, with the economic implications, and also with the energy crisis, basically. So here, I think that at the moment, we are at a situation where we are still waiting probably for the worst to come, because the points which were raised in this question, they are rather I would say they were rather the unexpected challenges which everyone had to face, including Russia. So there's some time for all the countries to sort of look around and to have a feel for this situation. But once they recover, and once the Russians recover, and once they realize what hit them and what hit the world and how is everyone reacting, there is a very strong chance and likelihood that they will use this against Ukraine and against the whole world. And I guess this is something to bear in mind. This is something to be prepared for. And this is something to start building our UK-Ukraine alliance around, and also other wider alliances across Europe and across the world, to be prepared to this new challenge and to countering this challenge. And I think that this again brings us back to the very beginning of this dialogue, the interparliamentary efforts which we can make all of us together in the different aspects of strengthening our relations. And I guess that we have started talking here about a number of issues, and that we should continue with our discussions, regardless that they are in Zoom and in this virtual kind of format, but they're still happening. We are still talking, and we are bringing issues to the table. And I hope that our next discussions will be focused particular on certain issues and on finding the solutions, that at the end we walk away with clear-cut instruments, and that when we meet again in person or during our cooperation on the various interparliamentary platforms such as the PACE or the NATO parliamentary platform or OSCE, etc., that we can already have the tools that we can implement in our struggle to keep Europe a safer place, essentially. And I want to use this opportunity also to thank all the participants again for joining us.
Thank you very much, Lesia. So I hear there a request for more Zoom interparliamentary dialogue, but if possible, a bit more focused. Alicia, over to you.
So I will put my hands up that I am by no means an expert in oil and energy, but I do think it is likely to make Russia's position more rash and more desperate. We know that Russia does not necessarily have the financial reserves to carry out the actions it is taking part in currently around the world. And I think it will become more reliant on its actions in Syria and Libya as well, because I suggest it will feel complacent closer to home in Crimea and so on. So it'll be interesting to see what does happen there. I think ultimately tonight was really interesting. It's really useful, and it's very helpful to understand what's on your minds and how we can work together. I think it's key we do have this dialogue, and I suspect without COVID, this dialogue would be a lot harder to create. I think it's really key that we stand by each other in our alliances, especially in light of hostile efforts to undermine those alliances. But I think also, as we've touched on tonight, it's key that we make the case for that alliance unapologetically to our populations, but also to our fellow parliamentarians. So I'm very grateful to you all for inviting me to join this evening. And I hope that working together we can build a new relationship that builds on what we have already between UK and Ukraine, especially as we go forward as a nation, where we will be changing how we function. And our friends, particularly in the East, will be more important than ever before.
Great, thank you. Lisa, Jasko, we need to unmute you. Thank
yeah,
you.
does it work? Yeah.
Yes.
Well, dear colleagues, I would also say that I'm not an expert in oil, so I probably won't answer this question, but I want to thank everyone who participated in our discussion. And I think with the overview of the problems and the perspectives that we discussed today, we are ready to discuss what can we do next and to think about probably positive agenda roadmap of our cooperation, including the topics that we discussed on, well, of course, security, but what I am personally I would like to emphasize is a need to strengthen cooperation on hybrid war, on a soft power, on climate change. These are the questions where we need to be very strong together. And I think Ukraine also has lots of experience that we can share with the world. And through cooperation with you, I think we could think and make some quite big things with this topic. So I'm also again extending warmest greetings from the Foreign Affairs Committee, and let's stay in touch and think about the next date when we can make a follow-up with already new ideas and suggestions, and also regarding the appointment of the co-chairs or chairs on the friendship group. This is something that is very important. We're looking forward to see more members of our British Parliament a part of this group. And I would like to know if you need more information or more communication from our side. Well, I know that all members of this discussion from Ukrainian side are very active MPs and very active in the friendship group, but maybe you need more, you would like to have us to organize more dialogue with the government side or with the parliament as a whole, Foreign Affairs Committee. I'm more than happy to help in organizing that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. And finally, Stuart, last word.
Well, on the oil question, I think much like as Alicia says, I think it makes Russia probably that bit more unpredictable going forward. I don't think we should discount the possibility of any kind of further kinetic action on their part. I think it would be dangerous to think that that couldn't happen. I think that, you know, we normally the Russian government are very good kind of catalysts for chaos, and the Chinese are very good at making the most of that chaos. I think we're seeing during the coronavirus crisis a bit of shift going on there on the Chinese side. I think we need to start thinking about that and the relationship between China and Russia. I'd be interested at some point in the future to talk more about Ukraine's relationship with China as well, and hear a bit more about the thinking there going forward. But I go back to really just echo what my three colleagues have said before me. You know, the world is more dangerous, and security in the broadest possible sense, human security, climate security, the kind of hard issues of national security need to have greater discussion. And as we embark on that in the UK under the guise of the government's integrated review on foreign and defence and aid policy, it's important that we keep Ukraine very much alive and on the agenda. I hope she won't mind me saying you have a very good ambassador here in London, a very good embassy staff here in London who have got, I think, most of our personal mobile phone numbers and know how to get us pretty quickly. And I think we need to, between us as parliamentarians, between our two countries, we need to work, once we've got our own friendship group back up and running properly, work at getting those clear communications between us up and running so that, so that our friendship can go from strength to strength. We can make the case for Ukraine, and we can do more to help your goals of growing your democracy and your Euro-Atlantic ambitions. You have a right to live freely and independently, and that's something we support.
Great. Thank you very much, Stuart. Well, I'm going to wrap it up at this point. We've come to the end of our 90 minutes. I'm sorry there were still a couple of questions which we didn't have time for, so I'm sorry for those people. But I'm so pleased that we've had a really good turnout particularly from parliamentarians, both in Ukraine and the UK, a very good wide-ranging discussion. I think if there's one thing that everyone has agreed on is that there really ought to be more of these discussions, but perhaps next time with a bit more focused agenda, not covering the whole waterfront, but picking out one or two subjects. And finally, I'd just like to pass on my thanks and the thanks of all of us to Natalia Halibarenko, to the Embassy of Ukraine for organizing this event and showing what can be done through Zoom, even in the time of coronavirus. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, goodbye everybody, and thank you.
Bye-bye.